Good morning. Just coming to cover them with that. Translating to lines in the show. Coming up, yeah. Okay. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. I have to make do with the light of time. Okay, just an announcement before we begin. This will be the last share dealing with Hilchot Shabbat before Pesach. There will be a share next week, and hopefully the week after as well. And then the following week there will not be a share because that will be Pesach or Erev Pesach. But the next share or two will be dealing with the Hilchot Leil HaSeder, things to do with Pesach, quite topical. So just today we are concluding Hilchot Kiddush. We're going to be talking about Kiddush Makom Seudah. We're in the books on page 80. So we'll begin, and as I say, from the next couple of weeks, we'll take a hiatus from Hilchot Shabbat to look at Hilchot Pesach. We'll have a little bit of a break for Pesach, and we'll resume afterwards, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so over the last few weeks, we have been discussing Hilchot Kiddush. Obviously, last week there was no share, but before that, been discussing Hilchot Kiddush, many different aspects of this, different aspects to talk about. The final one, which we're going to cover, is Kiddush b'makom seudah. Oh, there we go, just start. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Kiddush b'makom seudah. It's a phrase I'm sure everybody's heard. There is a lot that is really hidden in this phrase. We need to ask ourselves, when we say Kiddush b'makom seudah, what is the definition of a seudah? What is the definition of makom as well? When we say b'makom seudah, where is still considered makom seudah? When is still considered makom seudah? Okay, so those three questions hopefully should keep us busy for the next 45 minutes or so. So let's open on page 80. So we'll begin with the Sugya and the Gemara in our Pesachim, source number 41. And this is here where we learn from the obligation of Kiddush Makom Seudah in this Gemara. It tells us a number of other details as well. It begins by discussing the fact that we make Kiddush in the Beit Knesset. As we've mentioned a number of times, most places nowadays in Eretz Yisrael, this is not our minhag. In Chutz La'aretz, it is still very prevalent. You go to shul Friday night, the Chazan makes Kiddush, even though no one is really eating in the shul. So says the Gemara in source number 41, again, this is not a new question. It says the Gemara, those who had said, or those who had heard Kiddush in the Beit Knesset, Amar Rab, Yedei Yayin lo yatsu, Yedei Kiddush yatsu. So the assumption here is that somebody was in shul, they heard Kiddush that was said there, or they made Kiddush in shul, and now they're going home and eating a meal at home. So says Rav, there are two brachot, as we know, in the Kiddush on Friday night. There's the bracha of Yayin, right, Borei Pri Agafen, and there's the bracha of Kiddush. So Rav says, Yidei Yayin lo yatsu. The bracha over wine, and this is to do with the halachot of brachot, and this is to do with halacha b'shinoi makom, that if a person says a bracha, starts eating a meal in one place, nothing to do with Kiddush at this point. But if a person starts eating a meal in one place and he stops and he goes to eat somewhere else, would one have to make a new bracha? We dealt with that all the way back, I think, in volume 12. I'll refer to those shirim over there. It says Rav, Yidei Yayin lo yatsu. In other words, you said the Borei Pri Agafen over wine in shul. You're now going to go home and drink more wine. You need to make a new bracha. However, according to Rav, he says Yidei Kiddush yatsu. But regarding Kiddush, you have fulfilled your obligation for Kiddush. You would not have to go and say Kiddush again. That is Rav. Shmuel Amar, Av Yidei Kiddush lo yatsu. Shmuel says no. Even the obligation of Kiddush, you have not fulfilled. Okay, the Gemara also has a third opinion there, if I recall correctly. But in any event, Shmuel, the question is like this. Shmuel says you made Kiddush in shul, but you've not fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush. You have to go home and say Kiddush again. So why did you make Kiddush in shul in the first place? Right, this is probably why we don't make Kiddush in shul. Okay, says Shmuel, Right, in those days, you had guests who were coming in the shul doubled up, so they function also as a place of prayer, also as a sort of an inn, right, where people from out of town could come and could stay. And therefore there were people eating and drinking and sleeping in the Beit Knesset. Doesn't mean in the same room as where you daven, in the room next door. But okay, we'll get to that as well, because that's going to have relevance for us, yeah? But he says that it's only for the people that are eating there who fulfill the obligation of Kiddush. As the Shmuel Natame, Shmuel goes according to his reasoning, the Mashma and Kiddush Makom Suda. We hold that Kiddush, you've only fulfilled the obligation of Kiddush, the Makom Suda, in a place where you have your meal. And that is the halacha. That is what Shmuel says, and all the Rishonim and all the Achronim agree with that. And Kiddush Ela b'Makom Suda. Like I say, we still have to define what is Suda, what is Makom Suda. But the principle we accept. Yeah. Why is what in terms of if I remember correctly, I think Rabbi Yochanan also holds by this in this Gemara. They haven't brought it in here, but there's a discussion over there. But you can have a look inside the Gemara Pesachim. There's Rav, there's Shmuel, there's also Rabbi Yochanan, and there's the majority opinion is that we say in Kiddush Ela Makom Suda. In any event, now the Gemara begins to explain what does it mean Makom Suda. So it says several meaning. The students thought that what he meant was the following: in other words, if you go from one house to another, and I'll remind you that bayit, oftentimes in the Gemara, when it says word bayit, is what we would probably call cheder, in the same room. Comes in a bit later. They thought that if you go from one place to another place in the same house, no. In other words, there is no problem. So that actually probably does mean bayit, the way we think of it, in the same building. If you're going from one room to another. So Amaro Ravanan bar Tachlifa, Zimnin Sagin Hava Kaimna Kamei Dishmuel, V'nachin Me'igla La'ala V'Adam Makadesh. Okay, again, we'll go into all of this in a little bit of depth afterwards, but let's just see the overview for now. So he says like this, he says, sometimes I was by Shmuel, right on Shabbat, and he would go, Me'igra La'ara. He would go from one floor to a different floor, I was in the same building, and Hadar Makadesh, he would go back and he would say Kiddush again. In other words, the implication is that if you have different floors, different rooms in the same building, it's not necessarily considered the same makom. It's a very relevant question, comes up all the time. Over here, for example, in the shul, it used to be the minhag, it's changed, but it used to be that Kiddush would be made up here, upstairs, and then everybody would go downstairs and eat from the Kiddush in the room down there. Does that count? Is that considered Kiddush Makom Suda? The Suda, what's considered the Suda, is downstairs in a different room, and the Kiddush is here. Now that's not the way it's done anymore. Now Kiddush is made downstairs in the same room. So we'll talk about it. From the simple reading so far of this Gemara, it would seem to indicate that is problematic. And still more to talk about. The Av Rabba Sava, En Kiddush Ela Makom Suda. Rabba also holds right that there is no Kiddush, the Kiddush is only Makom Suda. The Ma'abai Kevina Beima Ki Hava Mekadesh Amala. Abai says when we were by Rabba for Shabbat, he would say to us, Ta'imu Midei Dilma Adazlitu Lushpiza Mit'aka L'chushraga. He would say, eat something now. Again, we're going to have to understand. When it says Ta'imu Midei, eat something, what does that mean? Does that mean bread? Does that mean a proper suda? Does that mean just a snack? Okay. But he says, eat something now, because you're going to go back to where you're staying, and maybe the candle has gone out, the lights have gone out. You're not going to be able to say Kiddush again over there. And you've not fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush now if you haven't eaten anything. Okay, so those are the three parts of our Gemara. What we see from here, the first part deals with the fact that we say this principle of En Kiddush Ela Makom Suda. Second part deals a little bit with the location, right? And the third part deals perhaps in terms of what is the Suda, what do we eat. So we'll come back and we'll discuss all of this. But what we see from here very much, Shmuel says, Rabbah says, and this is the psak of all the Rishonim and all the Achronim, En Kiddush Ela B'Makom Suda. Rashbam, source number 42, in his commentary here on the Gemara, explains a little bit. Why do we say Kiddush Makom Suda? He says, Dichtiv, in the third line, V'karata l'Shabbat oneg, that's the pasuk in the Navi, B'makom she'ata koreh l'Shabbat, the place where you call out Shabbat. How do we call out Shabbat? We declare Shabbat by making Kiddush. Shamtei oneg. There needs to be oneg, needs to be enjoyment as well. What is oneg? That refers to Sudat Shabbat. So that is a midrash. Inami, in other words, that's learned out from the pasuk. Inami svarau, you could say, not just learned from the pasuk, it's learned as a svara. The mideikva kiddush alayayin, when we say that we established the idea of kiddush over wine. Remember, I think the first year we discussed about kiddush from the Torah. Kiddush is just with words, but Chachamim said no, it has to be over wine as well. So they said, why not just over wine, but wine, which is significant, wine which you have at a meal together with the meal. So for one of those two reasons, we therefore say that we have to have kiddush makom suda. As I say, not everybody agrees. And that's the easy part. Now it starts getting a little bit more complicated. How do we define seuda for this matter? So we know we discussed, was it last week or the week before, in the context of Seudat Purim. We spoke midweek between Mincha and Mariv. For Seudat Purim, is one required to have meat? Is one required to have bread to wash over there? For Seudat Purim, it's not so clear cut, by the way. Most of the poskim agree, should be relevant for next year again. Most of the poskim agree that you should wash and you should have bread at the Seudat Purim, although there are opinions that it's not necessary. But when it comes to Seudat Shabbat, Seudat Yom Tov, etc., everybody agrees. In future shiurim we'll discuss the halachot of Shalosh Seudot and Seudat Shlishit, where it gets a little bit complicated as well. But in general, certainly the first two Seudot of Shabbat, the actual Seudah needs to be with bread. Question is, when you say Kiddush, does Kiddush have to be with that Seudah? Or is the definition of the Seudah for purposes of Kiddush maybe something less? So says the Tur, source number 43, it says, Katvu HaGeonim, top of page 82. Ad amea en Kiddush el makom Seudah, en tzarich shegmor sham kol Seudato. The Geonim have an opinion that what? That when we say Kiddush makom Seudah, it doesn't mean your entire Seudah, your full meal. Ela afilu achal davar mu'at o shata kos yain. Even if you ate something small, or you just drank a little bit of wine, for the purposes of Kiddush, that is considered Seudah. Shechayav alav bracha. Okay, what does it mean when he says that you have to say a bracha achrona? Any amount that you eat would be chayav b'nei bracha rishona. But so a kazayit, if it's a food, if it's a levit, if it's a wine, that you would have to say bracha achrona, yatzai yadei Kiddush. V'gomer Seudato makom acher. And then afterwards, so then you fulfill your obligation of Kiddush, and then afterwards go home and have your meal. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here in this opinion. The Torah says specifically that you ate bread or drank wine, but not if you ate fruit. So does he mean to say it has to be bread, or does he mean to say that just not fruit? There's another category in between, which is mezonot. So we'll get to mezonot in a moment. But where did the Geonim get this from? So seemingly they got it from our Gemara, where we say, where Rabbi told the students, he said, go now and eat something. Taste something, a teimah, could mean not another meal, but have a taste, have a snack, have something to eat. Now, yayin, we know is considered significant. It's a chashuv drink. Another question which comes up is when the Geonim say in shatak kos yayin shechayav alav bracha, so you need to drink a rebeit of yayin. Does that include the amount of wine that you drink for the sake of kiddush? Or are they saying you have to drink the amount of wine, you're drinking wine for the purposes of Kiddush, and over and above that, you need to drink a rebeit of yain for the sake of the Seudah. Okay, that's in terms of yain. In terms of eating, so then again Abraham says, yeah, speaking of the Geonim, if the Geonim hold that you can fulfill your obligation with wine, so all the more so we would say kal v'chomer that you could fulfill the obligation with mezonot. Why? Because mezonot is more chashuv than wine. And what's the proof of that? Think about brachot. Think about the order of brachot. We know we discussed, I think, last time, that whether one is required to cover one of the reasons why we cover the bread when we say kiddush is because really you should have said the bracha v'motzi lechem and haaretz first. So if you have a kiddush where you just have mezonot, is one required to cover the mezonot? We saw some opinions say yes, some opinions say no, but that is the sign that the mezonot is more chashuv, more significant. And the truth is, we'll see, there are going to be more opinions. Even those who won't rely on the Geonim for the purposes of drinking wine would rely on them for the purposes of having mezonot to fulfill kiddush. Okay, but that is opinion number one, which is really two opinions. Right? We have the Geonim. The Geonim say or really three opinions. You say if you drink a rebeit of wine, that is enough. So there are those who say that means a rebeit of wine in total, and there are those who say no, that means the melol ugmav that you need to fulfill the obligation of kiddush plus a rebeit of wine. So a little bit more than. Then there is an opinion based on the Geonim, which is that no, reviews of wine would not be enough. But if you ate mezonot, that would be acceptable. Now they say here, they say clearly, Tzur says, about perot, look, if it's not mezonot, if it's just fruit or vegetables or chocolate, charcoal, whatever it is, that is not considered silver. Now Tosfot in source number 44 has the opposite view. Has a higher level of fruit, it's an interesting question. The question was asked if within fruit one distinguish between the Shiva Minim and others because of the Bracha Chona. I haven't seen that. There's an interesting idea, but I haven't seen that distinction. Okay. Number 44, the Tosfot says, goes to the other extreme. But we do find in the Gemara that it's called te'ima, but it's referring to bread. It's referring to bread, which is the staple of a meal. And then he says, okay, we have found that other foods, maybe mezonot, etc., could count as part of your Seudat Shabbat when it comes to Seudat Shlishit. Let's say we'll deal with that in the future. But the last line of Tosfot says, the primary meals of Shabbat at night and in the morning has to have bread. And therefore, says Tosfot, when it comes to Kiddush, also Kiddush Makom Seudah is what is considered Seudat Shabbat, it's considered bread. Shulchan Aruch, source number 45, summarizes like this. It says, Katvu Adionim, had ein Kiddush elav Makom Seudah, afilu achad davar mu'at, o shata kos yain shechayav alav bracha, yatsa yedei Kiddush Makom Seudah. So he quotes the opinion of the Geonim, who say that even if you ate something small, meaning you drank some wine, you ate some fruit, some mezonot, that would be sufficient. However, when it comes to fruit, not. I will say there is an opinion, not brought here, but there is an opinion in the Ozarua, I believe it is one of the Rishonim, who says that even perot would be okay. But anything that you eat, he says that on Shabbat, anytime we eat, that is a fulfillment of on Shabbat, that is therefore considered significant. So you have perot, that would be okay. So you can see really there are all sorts of opinions, but that is not accepted by the Shulchan Aruch. And adds in the Ramah at the top of page 83. Says לפי זה היה מותר למואב ולסנדק לשתות מכושר מילה בשבת בשחרית אם שותים קשור ונהגו ליתן לתינוק. Okay, so again, based on this idea of the Geonim, the Ramah says, what happens if you have a Brit Milah in Shul on Shabbat morning? And now the question is whether the Moal or the Sandak or whoever can drink from the wine. Again, essentially that's your Kiddush. He says, based on the Geonim, you would be allowed to. It's the same question you mentioned previously. If you do make Kiddush in Shul, if the Chazan is saying Kiddush on Friday night as part of that, he's not going to be eating there, not the Makom Seudah, who would drink from the wine. So some places the main idea is to give to a child and the age of bar mitzvah to drink. That is one solution. Another possibility is that the Chazan himself drinks. But again, based on the Geonim, you say, how can you drink wine? How can you fulfill the obligation of Kiddush? You haven't had your Seudah. No, the Geonim said that that's your Seudah, drink your beads of wine. So therefore, there are those who say that he should drink more. There are those who say that he should drink just a minimal amount because he's not fulfilling his obligation, and he just said the Kiddush, he said that, so it shouldn't be a bracha levatala, just have a sip. There are those who say, Adrabah, he should, if he drinks, at least if he drinks the full cup, then according to that opinion, he's had makom seudah, and he can drink. But again, for the ordinary case of when we make Kiddush, we would not rely on this opinion of the Geonim. It's interesting because the Shulchan Aruch brings the Geonim, it's one opinion, whether it's wine or mezonot. In practice, again, what's done in most places, certainly in Shabbat morning, many people rely on the idea that mezonot is considered Seudah, but don't rely on the opinion that yain is considered a Seudah. Both of them come from the same place, from the Geonim. So let's go through the Mishnah Berurah here in source number 46. He adds a few details on this. So again, the Shulchan Aruch said, he quotes the opinion regarding drinking wine. So he says here in Kaf Hey or Shata Yain, Kol Sheken Imachal Minei Talgima Mechamesh Minei Minim Diatza. All the more so if you had one of the 5 grains, mezonot, you fulfilled fulfill the obligation. Then chashiva etzvei l'sodat Shabbat miyayin. These are more significant than wine when it comes to Sudot Shabbat. Another proof, by the way, where we see that Mezonot is more significant is when it comes to the name of Sudah Shlishit. According to some opinions, we're going to be able to fulfill maybe Sudah Shlishit by Mezonot more than we would by just having one. Right? If you're relying on the drink, then it's only wine, no other beverages would suffice. Notwithstanding everything that we said in previous shirim, if a person doesn't have wine, and under certain circumstances where one could make perhaps kiddush on a different beverage, but that would not fulfill the obligation of Suda. And then just the last line of Kafeh, he says, okay, right? To rely on this idea of wine being for your Suda, you should not rely on it unless it is extenuating circumstances. Now, Perot law, we said when it comes to fruit, that according to everybody would not fulfill the obligation. The Chamisha Minim Nikra Mazon, the Yayin Soed Alev, right? Mazonot, that's called Mazon, that's called food. Yayin has a special quality that it satiates the heart. Other food, even if you ate a lot of them, that's not considered a Suda. Okay, so what happens if, in our colloquially, what we'd say, you get invited to a Kiddush. People go to a Sudat Chatanim or Brit Milah, and they make a Kiddush there, and they don't have mazonos, they just have fruit platters. Okay, like Minei Megadim, Einu L'Dom Sham Klal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you find yourself in such a situation, you should not eat. V'lo sagi v'masha kadesh shoteh kol hakos, af shu machzik l'bit. So you'll say, but the person who's made Kiddush, he's drank the cup of wine, and therefore for him it is a Seudah, at least according to that opinion. Over the page, that only applies to the one who's drinking. It doesn't help others. We discussed, I think last time, regarding is there an obligation for everybody to drink from the wine? There is not. There is only an obligation, so long as the Malol Ugmav has been drank, only the one who's making the Kiddush has to drink. However, what defines it as a Makom Seudah? That is individual. That's what each, and you could have the opposite case, by the way. You could have the person, we discussed this before, you could have the person who makes the Kiddush. Let's say a person goes around to hospitals or whatever it is and goes and makes Kiddush for people. He makes the Kiddush, says the bracha, drinks a little bit of wine, and then moves on to the next ward. Okay? He has not fulfilled his obligation there of Kiddush because he hasn't had Makom Seudah. But if you have your Seudah there, then that's okay. That's fine. So the din of Makom Seudah, that's going to be individual for everybody. Now he does bring here that there is the opinion that says fruit is okay. He says every time you eat on Shabbat, that's considered a fixed meal, that is okay. But we don't follow that opinion. But if a person, again, extenuating circumstances, a person's feeling weak, they don't have any other food there, that's the only option they have. In the morning. There are those poskim who say you can rely on this in the morning. And of course, this goes back to what we discussed previously. And this is also another one of the reasons, perhaps, why we are much more lenient to rely even on mezonot for Kiddush in the morning. It's much less common to have a Kiddush on Friday night, aside from the technical logistic reasons. But because we saw machloket between the Rambam and the Ravid regarding Kiddush in the morning, do we say that the Kiddush of Shabbat day, which is the Rabbanan according to everybody, does it have the same restrictions and the same halachot regarding Shabbat Kiddush of Shabbat night? According to the Rambam, yes, but according to the Ravid, no. And the Ravid says, therefore, he says there is no prohibition to eat before Kiddush on Shabbat day. So, if we take those two things together, we say on the one hand, we do have opinions that say, even if I've had less than bread or even less than mezonot, that's still considered a Seudah. Plus, I have the opinion of the Ravid that says in the morning I could eat before hearing Kiddush, so even if I've not fulfilled Kiddush Makom Seudah, I could still eat that. Join those two things together, certainly in an extenuating circumstance, we have more of what to rely on. But again, in the Friday night, we'll be more stringent about this. And I'll just tell you, Rav Ovadia is actually a little bit more lenient over here than the Mishnah Berurah. Again, the Mishnah Berurah said, if a person finds himself on Shabbat morning at a Kiddush, and there is no mezonot, right, all you have is fruit or whatever, he says you shouldn't eat there, unless extenuating circumstances. Now, Rav Ovadia actually says, he also says l'katchila you shouldn't, but he says there is what to rely on if somebody finds themselves in this circumstance. He says, this is not in your sources. This is in Shutya B'Omer. Ovadia says, those who rely on this, who are lenient, have what to rely on. And one does not need to protest against it. It's possible before Shabbat, after Shabbat, you should tell them that they should have mezonot. But why does he say this? He says like this. He says, although the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch write that this is not doesn't help unless you have bread or wine or perot lo. It says, Adam says, in extenuating circumstances, we would rely on this idea that even fruit is considered makom suda. Therefore, in this case, if it's in the morning, the daytime, Kiddush, then you would allow it. There is another caveat, however. He says, if one relies on this, then when one goes home and has lunch, then one would have to say Kiddush again. But why? Because if we're saying that the reason you can rely on it is a combination of factors, it's a combination of the fact that maybe it is considered makom suda, and you call it a sveik. One suffix that maybe it actually is the suda, even though it's not bread. But also, maybe you don't need Kiddush, because we go according to the opinion, you can eat before Kiddush. Okay, fine. But therefore, you haven't fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush when eating fruit, but you still need to go home and make Kiddush before you have lunch. So this is one of the reasons why somebody asked me about this after the very first share on your Kiddush, that sometimes you go to a Kiddush in Shul, whatever it is, and you go home, and then you make Kiddush again before lunch. Is one required to do that? One is not required to do that, me'ikar. It's a hidur. The Mishnah Berurah also writes that it's a hidur. It's a nice hidur to have. One of the reasons for that hidur might be because maybe you haven't actually fulfilled the obligation of Kiddush in the first place, but you were still allowed to. Another reason might be the Rambam writes that at all three meals of Shabbat, we should have wine. We should have wine as part of the Suda. He includes Suda Shlishit in that, by the way. It's not our minhag, but there might be another reason for that. Okay, so just to summarize, because I know we've gone through a lot and it's gotten a bit, maybe it's gotten a bit complicated. Let's have a look over here at the summary on page 84 in the middle. It says like this: one may eat other grain products as brachais mezonot instead of bread or wine after Kiddush. Not all agree with the leniency that just wine is permitted, so we should only rely on it in cases of need. One may not normally eat fruit to fulfill Kiddush makom suda in cases of need. One may rely on that, again, during the daytime. And according to what we've seen, one must eat bread, grain products, or possibly drink wine in order to fulfill the requirement of Kiddush makom suda. Again, the Pnei Lachat, source number 47, just to summarize it another way, he says, Ledat HaGeonim, right, that's the Geonim say there's no bread, there's no mezonot, a revi'at of wine would be okay. Under extenuating circumstances, we can rely on that. Right, if it's the nighttime Kiddush, so drink the wine in addition to the amount that you need for Kiddush. And again, these extenuating circumstances, as I mentioned, this may come up and probably is coming up very, very often with the Chayalim and all sorts of cases over there. Top of page 85. If somebody heard Kiddush in Shul and they drank less than or they only drank juice, not grape juice, and they had less than a kazayit of mezonot, lo yatzeh yadech about Kiddush, you've not fulfilled your obligation of Kiddush. You've also eaten and drank without Kiddush, which is a prohibition. And therefore you'd have to go home and make Kiddush again. It's always, remember in Shiva as well, and sometimes you're at a Kiddush and people say, who can say a bracha for now? You want somebody to say bracha for now for everybody? And say, no, I didn't need a kazayim. Okay, well, if you didn't need a kazayim, then you haven't fulfilled the obligation of Kiddush, so you have a bigger problem. So everybody should be able to say their own bracha for now. If you then want to rely on somebody else to say it for you and answer remain, that's fine. There are opinions, as we saw based on Tosfot. There are those that are more stringent that would only have Kiddush when eating bread. That was apparently the minhag of the Gra. It did 40 and 48, the Bio Halacha. So B'Sefer Maseh Rav, again, this is the book which collates a number of the different hanagot, the practices, the minhagim of the Vil Magal. Katav Shagla after Kiddush Yom, Lo Haya Makadesh Ela B'Makom Suda Gmura. He only have Kiddush with the bread, V'lo Minei Talgima or Yain. Again, some people follow that formula, but it is not strictly required. One other pointer, it's interesting. What if there is somebody who cannot eat bread, or who cannot eat grains, somebody has celiac, or diabetics, different cases like that, where for health reasons one is unable to eat these foods. So there is brought in the name of the Chazon Ish that if somebody says, for example, the doctor said they can only eat, they can't eat grains, they can only eat vegetables. So since that is their fixed food, that is considered their kiyut, that is considered their suda, and that would be sufficient. Rav Chaim Kanievsky brings a proof of this. Rav Chaim Kanievsky says that the Torah calls the man, it calls it lechem, calls it bread. When we discussed once, what was the bracha that was said on the man in the desert? According to many Rishonim, that was Hamotzi lechem min hashamayim. That was but the man is called bread, and we learn from there, from the man, the halachot, the concept of 3 sudot. Even though the man itself wasn't actually bread, but it was the main thing which was sustaining them. And therefore he says as well, so if the person has for health reasons is unable to eat bread as a matter of course, then they can rely on it. Drink a bit of wine. They can't drink wine either, then they can rely on whatever it is that they eat. That would be their fixed that would be considered their food. Again, it's true that we don't eat bread as much as maybe was done in the days of Chazal, but nonetheless, that is still, unless it's for health reasons, and a person is really unable to eat it. But when we have a Sudat Shabbat, or we have Sudat Yom, we still have the bread. We still have that gold standard. Okay. Second question, now which we can discuss, is in terms of proximity of time of Kiddush to the meal. Now it says Kiddush Makom Surah relates to place. So does place mean it's in the same room? What happens? The person comes home from shul, makes Kiddush, and says, okay, now we're going to sit and read or fall asleep on the couch, whatever it is, and in 2 hours time we'll have lunch. Does that suffice? Does that Kiddush, does that work? So the Ramah, based on the Maharil, source number 49, says no. Needs to be immediately. We'll talk in a moment exactly what immediately means, but it needs to be straight away in the place of the Kiddush. Or you could have in mind to eat there straight away. Okay? If let's say you have in mind, you make Kiddush and you're about to have the meal, and then somebody falls over and they need to go and get a plaster, and then they can whatever it is, and you get delayed due to unforeseen circumstances. So that is still considered the Kiddush was part of the meal. It was your intent to eat straight away. But what if your intent is not to eat straight away? Meaning it's not just the place, the geographical proximity, but there needs to be a time proximity as well. Now the Mishnah Berurah seems to be very stringent on this point. Source number 50. He says, lo yafsik afilu zman katsar, even for a short amount of time. So we don't really have an indication of how many minutes this is or how long it is, etc. We don't have the sources here in the Tzurba, but I'll just tell you. So the Sephardi poskim are actually a lot more lenient on this. And there are a number of Sephardi poskim who say we aren't so concerned about the time factor. They do say, however, 72 minutes, which is generally considered, that is the time if a person starts a meal, and more than 72 minutes have passed, we consider it as if that meal has ended. One would then need to make a new bracha. One would say Birkat Hamazon needs to be within 72 minutes, generally speaking, of the time that one is eaten. So more than 72 minutes have passed, that is not good, and then one would have to make Kiddush again. But from when you end it. Rav Ovadia writes that's fine as well. L'katchila should eat straight away after Kiddush, but so long as within 72 minutes, that is fine. The Raman and the Mishnah Berurah, as you've seen, were a little bit more machmir on this, but the Aruch HaShulchan says the following. Again, it doesn't appear in your slide, but I'll read you. The Aruch HaShulchan says, That was the word which was used. It means immediately. That word is familiar to us. I'm sure everybody remembers from Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, the traditional greeting on the first night. We say to people, we want to be signed and sealed immediately in the book of life, because the Gemara tells us that the tzaddikim gemurim are signed and sealed immediately, and we want to judge everybody as a tzaddik gamor after the first night of Rosh Hashanah. The second night of Rosh Hashanah, you can just say Good Yom Tov, because that doesn't apply anymore. But in any event, actually says that in the Machzor, by the way. There's a page, many of the Machzorim have got all the greetings. Remember, in the article Machzor, it has the whole greeting for the first night. It says after the first night, you can just say Good Yom Tov. Okay. Yereli de la alta ena kavana techef mamash. Says Aruch HaShulchan, it doesn't mean actually immediately, without stopping for a moment. It means you've got to be reasonable here. Don't wait an hour, don't wait a long time. Well, it's not given to angels, to be so exact with us. After Kiddush, that was the minhag in his town, I guess, that people went and got changed or whatever it is. So you're doing things, you're getting ready. The poskim also write that anything that you're doing for the sake of the Suda would also be okay. So he says the point is that you shouldn't wait a long time. There shouldn't be unnecessary delay in between. That's the other.
What's the implication of this in the whole conversation we had about, having something, it's not too deep, but having enough to be, let's say, like, see if it comes through down, but not sitting down and watching and telling you what.
I don't understand.
Everything up to here, we're talking about, right, between like, you need to do something, right, and then you're going to sell, right? Things like that, not payroll, but other things can, right? And here it's making it sound like, that you still have to stand and have your see that, you're supposed to see that after that anyway.
I mean, whatever, right, I mean, according to many of the poskim we've seen, according to the Megawan, etc., that still the ideal is still the Kiddush, and then one has one's main meal. That's the ideal. But whatever it is, whether it's your main meal or your mazonot or whatever, the point is there needs to be a connection between the Kiddush and the. We wouldn't say that a person's going to have a person's about to have their main meal. Let's say a person comes home on Shabbat morning and you make Kiddush, and you still have to, I don't know, chop up a little bit of salad or whatever. It's going to be another 10 minutes before you done. We wouldn't therefore say that a person should have cake in the interim and then start eating. No, that's not necessary. Right. Obviously, better to have things ready before. There is another aspect here which we haven't mentioned, which is that any time before we have a meal of Shabbat or of Yom Tov, a person shouldn't eat too much beforehand, so they'll still have a ta'avon, so they won't be too full and they'll be able to enjoy their meal. So if a person eats too much of Kiddush, and then you go down and you have your meal and you're not hungry because you ate everything at the Kiddush, so that's also not appropriate. Yeah. Okay. That's why, by the way, we had this. We actually had this argument in a former congregation of mine where they had a Kiddush every week, and it was like a Kiddush with cholent and kugel and everything, every week. So there were some people who were very opposed to it, and they said it's not. By the time you get home, you're not hungry. You don't have any lunch. Then in the winter, we introduced that. There were rolls actually at the Kiddush because it was the only way on a very, very short Shabbat. The only way to get up to the Russian street as well. Of course, people were opposed to that also, and they said, no, you should not start anything earlier, whatever. But, yeah. Okay, so we have discussed the definition of a Suda. Let's discuss now the definition of Makom. What does it mean, the location of a meal? What if you have Kiddush in one room and you have a meal in another room, if they're in the same building, if you're in a different building, if you can see the place, you go into the place, etc. One thing I will just say from the outset is that Kiddush Makom Suda does not mean that one needs to stand in the exact same location, right, where one had the Kiddush. Like if one wants to change seats at the table, that's okay. Or if one's in a big hall and you make Kiddush at one table and now we screw to another table, you don't have to go to exactly. That's not what we mean when we say Makom Suda. The same room is still considered the same place. Again, I will use the phrase which we quoted in the Aruch HaShulchan, Lo ne'natra lemalachei Hashem. Not too badly, one that doesn't need a GPS or make sure they have the exact same location as where they make Kiddush. But we do have a discussion as to what happens when one goes from one room to another. So you remember the Gemara that we began the share with, all the way back on page 18. The Gemara there discussed that if you have two different levels within the same house, and you made Kiddush on one level and then you went down and ate somewhere else, you would have to make Kiddush again. It's not considered the same location. So we have the Rosh on source number 51. The Rosh quotes Rabbeinu Nissim. This is Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon. This is not the Ran of Rabbeinu Nissim, because he came later. But he says Rabbeinu Nissim Zakatav, that's the Dehad Amrin and the En Kiddush El Makom Suda, Hainu Hecha Shaya Bedato Mitchila Lecho, B'Makom HaKiddush, B'Shuv Nimlach V'Achal Makom Acher. He says, if you had in mind to eat in one place when you made Kiddush, and then after Kiddush you changed your mind and now you want to go eat somewhere else, so that's not called Makom Suda. Okay, so this is the Kiddush. It says Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon. Again, we discussed these halachot in the context of Birkat HaMazon, in terms of Shinoi Makom for brachot, number of overlaps between the two areas of halakha. But he says that if you had in mind, even if you were in one place, and you had in when you made Kiddush, but you had in mind from the moment of Kiddush you were going to eat somewhere else, that is still sufficient. So says Rabbi Nissim Gaon. And he brings a proof of this from the Yerushalmi, okay, to do with if one has from the Sukkah, if one makes Kiddush in the home, and it goes to the Sukkah, etc. Now, Lichora, second paragraph, says the Rosh, Lichora, Nereda Yerushalmi, Palega Gemara. Then it seems that this Yerushalmi goes against our Gemara. Because we saw already, the Gemara said, you make Kiddush upstairs, and you go to eat downstairs, you need to make Kiddush again. We could explain that it's not a machloket. The mashma b'Yerushalmi the melotnai l'shmur aynu b'makom l'makom kmo me'ala le'igla. The hachi ayu b'Yerushalmi mibayit l'sukkah. Since that which the Yerushalmi says that you could have in mind to go to eat somewhere else, that is like if you have in mind you make Kiddush upstairs and you have in mind to go and eat downstairs. You have in mind to make Kiddush here in the shul, and you have in mind that you're going to go and eat in the hall downstairs. Okay, that's all in the same building. He says that's maybe what the Yerushalmi was talking about. But if you go from one room to another, in other words, that may still be what the Yerushalmi was talking about, but that, according to Babli, would not be okay. If you go from one house to a different house. Okay, so that is the Rosh. So he says that according to both Yerushalmi and the Babli, you could have in mind to go and have Kiddush after you had Kiddush, to go and eat somewhere else in the same building, and that would be okay. The Ran, on the other hand, that was Rabbeinu Nissim Gaon, who was in T'kuva the Gaonim. The Ran, Rabbeinu Nissim, who was one of the Rishonim, one of the later Rishonim, he says no. He says he completely disagrees. He says at the end of source 52, which is involved, Vadai Yerushalmi Pliga. He says no, it is completely a machloket between Yerushalmi and the Babli. We hold like the Babli. In other words, you have to have Kiddush in the same place. You have to eat in the same place where you've made Kiddush, and there is no stipulation, there is no condition. That does not work. So says the Shulchan Aruch, quotes both of these views. He says, "En Kiddush elav makom seuda, ubabayit echad mipina lepina chashuv makom echad." But again, bayit is maybe interchangeable with the word cheder, the word room. It says, in one room from one side to another, it's the large room, the large hall, that's all considered the same place. But it has to be in the same place. Im kidesh lechol b'pina zo, v'nemlach lechol pina chelet, afilu taklin gadol, einot tzach lechzor l'kadesh. That is fine. Says the Rama, mibayit l'sukkah, chashuv k'mipina lepina. Okay, that's the rule of Sukkot. He says sometimes you have it where you make Kiddush in the Sukkah and you eat in the house, or vice versa. Okay, we're not getting into that now. Top of page 88. He says the Shulchan Aruch, Yesh Omrim, Shekol Shoem Makomo, Afilu Bayit Lechatzel, Einot Tzach Lechzor L'kadesh. Now, there is an opinion that even if you are now not in the same building as you were before, so long as you can still see it, again, there is that connection in terms of eye contact that creates the proximity, then there are those who say that is considered the same place. But Yesh Omrim, Shim Kidesh Makom Echad, Al Da'at Lechol Makom Acher, Shapil Dami. There are those who say, again, based on Yerushalmi, that if we had in mind, when we said Kiddush in one place, had in mind to eat somewhere else, that is okay. However, the condition is, that again, that's in the same building, or that you can see both places. Says Ramach Hanikah, so we follow that. Im Kiddush b'bayit echad al manat lechol sham, ve'achar kach nimlach lechol makom acher, If you make Kiddush in one place and then you decide to eat somewhere else, well, then you need to go back and make Kiddush again. Okay, so let's just see. Rav Yitzchak Yosef, source number 54. I'll put Yosef. One had in mind from the beginning, when making Kiddush, to go and eat somewhere else, if there is a reason, if he can see the first place, then he can go, and if he has a reason, he can go and he can change his place. In other words, to sum up, Kiddush makom suda. So ideally, I need to eat my suda, however we define that, and that was the first part of the share, in the same place as I made Kiddush, in the same room. If I had in mind that I'm in one room now, and I'm going to where I'm making Kiddush, and I'm going to go and eat somewhere else, so that we could rely on that if we have two conditions. Ideally, you have two conditions in place. The two conditions are that it's A, in the same building, right, even though it's a different room, and B, that you can see the original location, you can see the room one from the other. If one of those conditions is missing, then we would say if it's a shadat chak, and if there is a pressing need for it, for example, a pressing need could be that people are, that is the only way, otherwise people aren't going to be able to hear the Kiddush, and people aren't going to be able to get to eat, so then we could rely on that. But it needs to be either that it's in the same building, or that you could see both places, and you need to have that in mind when you make Kiddush. So Bi'alacha source 55, he says, right, that's what we just said. Only if there is a case of need. Right, and then he says about halfway down, he says, to go from one room to another, from one building to another, we should avoid it if possible. If it's in the same building and you can see the other place, then it's okay, that you could rely on. And then just a summary for you in English, on page source 56, from Rav Simcha ben Makaran. This is a contemporary work on Hilchot Shabbat. He says, one who wishes to make Kiddush in one room and eat in a different room must not only have this in mind when making Kiddush, but he must also be able to see the place where he made Kiddush. If both these conditions have not been met, one may not switch rooms for the meal. However, if one did so and ate his meal there, he need not repeat if at least one of the above requirements has been met. Okay, next paragraph. If there are extenuating circumstances, however, one is permitted to switch to the second room if at least one of the above requirements has been met. And then, as we said, to go from a different building completely, that is more complicated, and that is more considered a shinoi makom. Again, it's also considered a shinoi makom for the purposes of Hilchot brachot, and therefore it's going to be more complicated for this. So the final paragraph here really relates to our case, what I mentioned before. What like in the shul where we make Kiddush on a Shabbat morning, and again, if there is a reason, an extenuating circumstance for here, what would be the reasons to support it and the reasons to oppose? The advantage we have is that, again, we're dealing with the same building. If we're dealing with a different building, the question would barely even begin. We're dealing with the same building. However, the problem is, from here you can't see the whole downstairs, and from there you can't see up here. So since you cannot see the room where you're eating, the room where you make Kiddush, it becomes a little bit more problematic. Again, the poskim say that if that is the only way that it can be done, and there is a pressing need for it, so then it is acceptable. Again, but nowadays that is why, it's one of the reasons why, it's not from a technical logistical reasons as well, but now Kiddush will be made downstairs, Kiddush, and the Suda is in the same room, and that is the Katkila. There is no problem with that. The only problem with that is that some people don't have patience to wait for everybody to come down and make Kiddush. So anyone else, you're going to have to learn patience. Okay, Adkan, that concludes our series on Hilchot Kiddush. Next week, as I say, will be a show on Hilchot Pesach with Rav Hashem, and possibly the week after, but I'll let you know next Sunday, and then we'll have a break there for Pesach, and we'll resume Hilchot Kiddush afterwards. Wonderful day and wonderful week, everybody. Yep.